Hello, it's me, Radhia, and welcome to another video. I have a shop update coming up very soon, and so I have been diligently working on a few handmade goods, particularly this stack of zipper pouches. I thought, why not have a change of pace where I share my process of how these are made from start to finish. This isn't really a tutorial, nor is there a pattern, but I will leave a link to a video that I followed for a very basic flat zipper pouch, but I did add my own adjustments here and there. If you didn't know, I am a person of many trades. On top of being an illustrator who draws, I also really love fiber arts and making tangible things. So if this is your cup of tea, please grab one of your own projects to work on while I sew one of these pouches. Before we get into the rest of the video, I would like to thank our sponsor, which is flexispot. This is actually one of flexispot's desks that they gifted to me back in 2020, and now that I have moved into a different apartment, I actually have space for another desk. This is the flexispot Pro Plus standing desk in the E7 model. I actually requested a bigger desktop surface this time around since I wanted to create a workspace for my sewing projects. So it's pretty neat that you're able to customize this desk to fit your space and also choose the material for your desktop. I personally chose the white desk since it makes it easier to see my project and also film it with a bit of contrast. This particular model features an LCD keypad that controls the height adjustment electronically and allows you to save up to 4 height presets. I have one saved for my preferred seating height and another one for standing, which helps a lot whenever I'm using my serger or pressing seams. There's also a USB charging port on the side as well as a child lock button that prevents height tampering. I really love how much surface area this desk has and just how fluidly the height adjustment works. FlexiSpot will be having a big discount for their 6-year anniversary, so between September 7th to the 9th of 2022, you'll be able to save up to $200 off during their Tech Day sale on their official website. If you are an artist or someone seeking a really nice height adjustable desk, I highly recommend one from FlexiSpot. I absolutely love both of my FlexiSpot desks, and I'm slightly relieved that now I have a place where I can park my sewing machines and I don't have to worry about moving them from a surface to another surface. I now have a dedicated workspace that is big enough to handle all of my sewing needs. So if you're interested or in the market for a really nice desk, I'll leave all of the information in the description below. Thank you again to FlexiSpot, and now we can move forward with the rest of the video. Hello, voiceover Radhia here. I will be narrating the rest of this video for y'all. Right now I am opening up this Juki serger that I ordered, and y'all, I have been sewing for a long time and I have always wanted a serger, so I'm so excited to use this machine. It's a little different than a sewing machine. A serger essentially creates seams and finishes the edges of the fabric so it prevents it from fraying or unraveling throughout use. As you can see, it has a pretty complex threading system, not like your traditional sewing machine which uses one spool of thread, but this indeed uses 4 big cones of thread to create that overlock stitch. The best part about having a serger is that it has the capability of sewing on stretchy knit fabric, something like a t-shirt, which means I could potentially start making my own clothes, which is pretty exciting. I also labeled the knobs that control the tension, and that way I'll have a better understanding of how this machine works. Here's my cat, Uni. He's just a really curious little guy, and he's also my studio assistant. Right now I am ironing out some fabric that I've pre-washed and pre-shrunk. I actually use unscented detergent for anyone that might have sensitive skin, because I've also done some fabric face masks in the past, but for this video we'll be doing fabric pouches. But I actually designed this fabric myself. It's based off of a sticker sheet that I've made that I also sell, and so I took those spot illustrations and I turned them into, I think I made a half drop pattern. When I went to college at the School of Visual Arts, I took a class that taught me all about surface design, and so it's pretty cool having the knowledge of just being able to like make your own pattern and just apply it on a tangible thing. Like literally I designed my own fabric, had it printed, and I'm now making the thing out of my own artwork, so that's pretty cool. I actually got this printed through Spoonflower, and I think this is their regular cotton fabric. I do know cotton is pretty water intensive in terms of environmental factor, but I absolutely despise polyester or any synthetic material because it's literally plastic, and I do think cotton just holds up and ages pretty well, especially for something like a fabric mask or a pouch. I wouldn't want that deteriorating.
If you couldn't already tell by now, I put in a lot of thought and time and energy and also love and care into every step of the way of any product I design and produce and put out into my shop. And I've ironed out all 4 yards of this fabric and I've rolled it onto literally a closet rod, and that is to prevent it from wrinkling, because if I fold it again it's gonna get wrinkles, and I prefer having all of this fabric rolled up, and it's just easier for me to cut and use this fabric along the way. So right now I'm just cutting off that excess white edge with a ruler and a rotary blade. It looks like a pizza cutter, but rotary blades and a nice ruler with some grip are your best friends when it comes to making straight cuts. And you could totally use scissors, but now that I have discovered the power of a rotary blade, I'm like, wow, this makes everything so much neater. And right now I'm trying to sort of figure out if the fabric got a little bit warped while it was in the wash, and so I'm just cutting off another edge of fabric to make sure it's parallel with the rest of the roll. Also, I will say, please be very careful when handling a rotary blade, especially if you're cutting through multiple layers of fabric like I am right now. But if you're too intimidated by a rotary blade, just use a nice sharp pair of fabric scissors. Do not use those fabric scissors for anything else. Right now I am cutting the rectangles of the body of that fabric pouch, and I'm using a self-healing mat underneath it to make sure that everything is nice and perfect. I actually found that mat in someone's recycling on the street, and I took it home and I washed it, and I'm like, literally, who threw this out? Because now it's mine. Here I am trying to use this like mini iron that I bought, and I got it for pressing the seams of quilt pieces, but I don't think I read the instructions and I don't know if it actually works. So I actually switched to a regular iron, and right now I'm ironing the inner lining of the fabric, and I'll be using a gingham fabric this time. And so this iron is actually older than I am. I think my parents bought this iron before I was born, and when I moved out I decided to take it with me because I do so much sewing stuff, and the ironing pad that I'm using underneath is so convenient. It's actually like a thick wool ironing pad instead of using a whole ironing board, and I can just use it on my desk. I spritz the fabric with a little bit of water to get the wrinkles out and kind of steaming it out. And now look at the power of this standing desk. I can just adjust it when I sit down to use my sewing machine. How cool is that? Up next, I'll be preparing the zipper for the pouch. This is a small trick I learned where you fold the ends of the zipper tabs down towards the back at a 30-degree angle and tack it down with a couple of stitches. This is an extra step and more of an aesthetic choice that prevents these zipper bumps that can be visible in the final pouch. I've also swapped out my sewing foot for a specialty zipper foot that makes it easier for sewing zippers onto fabric. This is what it looks like, and I'll repeat this process on all 4 corners of this zipper. As I mentioned, this is a bit of extra work, but it just makes the final product look so much neater. So now I'll be sewing the zipper onto the fabric, so I sandwich the right side of the zipper with the right side of the fabric. So when it's sewn, it'll kind of look like this. I'll also add that gingham lining on the back of the zipper, so now it's sandwiched between the 2 pieces of fabric. The actual rectangles of fabric are a little bit longer than the length of the zipper, and that's so there's enough seam allowance to sew around the perimeter of the pouch. I also make sure to center the zipper from the left and right edges of the fabric. Okay, so a normal person would use pins or clips to hold everything in place, but I've done this so many times that I just start sewing. I use the edge of that zipper foot to make sure my stitching is straight and even, and I also make sure the edges of the fabric are flush with the edge of that zipper on the right side. I always backstitch to make sure the stitching doesn't unravel. As I'm sewing, I'm also double checking that everything is nice and even. I'll reach a point where the zipper is actually in the way despite using a zipper foot, and that's because there's the zipper pull. So what I do is I'll lift the zipper foot up with the needle still in the fabric, and I'll pivot the work so I can pull the zipper out of the way and continue sewing. So I'm backstitching again. I always do this at the beginning and also at the end of a stitch, and I'm just checking that everything is nice and flush, and I'll just snip that away. And as you can see, it's starting to look like it's coming together. There's the right side. I flipped it the other way around, and this is just one side of the pouch. I'll basically repeat the same thing on the other side of the zipper. While I sew the other half of this pouch, I wanted to answer a few questions my followers sent to me on Instagram throughout bits of this video. A lot of people asked, how did I start sewing? So I learned how to sew from a very young age from my mom. I grew up in a low-income household, so there was more emphasis on mending or tailoring the clothes that I already had when I was a child. This sounds hella sustainable, but we did this out of necessity, so it's still a practice I keep with me to this day. I remember I would always want those Disney princess costumes, but they were so expensive, so my mom would literally make princess gowns for me from scratch and would use existing clothes of mine to make the patterns. She taught me the very basics of hand sewing and using a sewing machine, but I want to say I was maybe 8 or 9 when I started learning. The sewing machine I'm actually using in this video is discontinued, but I've been using it for over 10 years and it's held me down since then. My mom would also sew clothes for my American Girl doll, and if y'all know anything about those dolls, they are expensive. So I really couldn't afford the clothing sets or accessories, so my mom would make these tiny clothes, and I would use cardboard to make furniture or use polymer clay to sculpt pretend food. And I think that's one of the lighter things about growing up less fortunate, is that I really had to get creative with the very little resources around me, and it's nice to see how much of this knowledge has taken shape in the work that I make today. Another person asked if it was possible to sew this by hand, and the answer is technically yes. However, it would take much longer and much more precision. I mean, back in the day, literally everything was sewn by hand until the industrial sewing machine rolled around. If it's possible for me to sew something on the sewing machine, I will. However, there are certain things that require more attention to detail that are better sewn by hand. Someone else asked for some tips on sewing a straight line. On my sewing machine, I'll usually use my presser foot as a guide, or there's actually markings on that metal plate that help me keep all of the edges very even, and it's usually done through a lot of control and patience. If you're trying to sew a straight line by hand, you can literally just use a ruler and like a disappearing ink pen and just mark it directly on the fabric and use that as a guide. Now you can see I have both sides of the pouch sewn onto the zipper with the lining. I always check if the zipper is functional in case it accidentally gets caught against the fabric. We are nearly done, and it's so close to looking like an actual pouch, but before I do that, I need to press the top and the underside of the zipper with the iron. I pull the fabric taut and press it close to the zipper to get it nice and crisp. I try not to leave it too long on the zipper because it is plastic, so I didn't want to accidentally melt it, but I'll be adding a top stitch near the zipper later, so this process helps the pouch stay nice and flat. This is my favorite piece of the pouch that gives it a nice accent, and it's a woven tag with my name on it. And it says, "Made with love, Radhia Rahman." That's me. I'll center the tag on the outside of the pouch, and I'll usually put it on the side where the zipper is going from left to right because I'm personally just right-handed, and I just stitch it directly onto the outer shell of the fabric. I won't stitch it into the lining, and then I give it a couple stitches. I snip everything off. This is the most tedious part of any sewing project, just getting the snips in and cutting away all the stray threads, and it just makes it look so much more neater, and I just want to get out all of those tiny pesky threads. This is what it looks like when it's done, and it's just a small detail that pulls the look of the pouch together. Now I'll be top stitching the pouch on the left and right side of the zipper, and this gives it a nice finish and also a professional look. The stitch goes through the lining as well, and I like to use a longer stitch. I think it just looks nicer for a top stitch, and I just go along the whole length of the pouch, and then again I pause to pivot the fabric around the needle, pull the zipper back, and finish off the stitching. I've turned the pouch around and I'm just repeating the top stitch on the other side. I'm also making sure to move the zipper out of the way. I'm actually using the edge of the zipper foot as a guide to keep a straight and even stitch all the way down. And now you can see this beautiful top stitch that does make a huge difference in the look of the whole pouch. Now I'm basically halfway done sewing this pouch. It's time to match the right sides of the fabric and the lining with each other. This is why it's important to cut perfect rectangles, because you want all the edges and the corners to line up with each other. It's also very important to open up that zipper before you sew around the perimeter because it needs to get flipped inside out. Do not forget this step. Any sane person would also use pins, but I do not, so we are basically sewing around the perimeter. However, at the lining, we're going to leave this open gap, and that's where the whole project will be flipped inside out. Because I'm done sewing the zipper, I'll be swapping out that zipper foot for a 1/4 inch seam allowance foot, and this will help me keep those seams very even. I'm using the right side of that foot to sew all the way around the perimeter. This is the part where I take my time because I want to make sure everything is nice and even. There's literally no rush. When I get to the corners, I just leave a little bit of room I'll pivot the fabric around the needle and I'll continue sewing down. We are heading to the trickiest part of sewing around the perimeter of this pouch because we have reached the zipper and I want to make sure the fabric is evenly lined up so when we flip it inside out it won't look wonky. There's a lot of bulk in this area because of the zipper, so I go a little slower. I will lift my presser foot up and make sure I don't hit any of the metal parts because that could potentially snap the needle. Actually turn the project around, I pivot it on the needle again and backstitch a couple of times, and this is just so the pouch stays intact in the areas where it's pulled around the most. While I sew around the rest of the pouch, I thought I'd answer a few more questions. A lot of my followers asked where they can learn the basics of sewing or how to start. Even though my mom taught me the fundamentals of sewing, most of my desired knowledge came from YouTube videos that are literally free or reading through my sewing machine manual. You can totally start off hand sewing and buy a secondhand sewing machine or borrow one from a friend if you don't feel as committed. You can also check if there are any sewing workshops in your area. I grew up always having a sewing machine in our household, so I don't know if I could exist without one. It's one of those things you can't really find anymore outside of a craft or hobby shop because of the frequency of fast fashion where people aren't making or mending their clothes as often. I really love this channel called With Wendy and also this other channel called Tilly and the Buttons. I love learning how to resize or flip my clothing to something I can fall in love with again. I'm no master at sewing and there's so much I have yet to learn, but once you understand the basics, it's far less intimidating than you think. My knowledge of sewing clothes started off with sewing clothes for my American Girl dolls, so you can always start with an easy project and work your way up when you feel confident. As you can see, this is why it's very vital to actually pull that zipper open when you sew around the perimeter, because if it was closed, you would not be able to turn your project inside out, and so that would be... I have done that before, and I've had to seam rip open a pouch in the past. So make sure you open up that zipper before you sew around the perimeter. Once you're nearly done sewing all the way around the perimeter, we're going to make sure to leave this gap, so do not sew it closed. Just give it a little back stitch, and that little gap is where we are going to be turning that pouch inside out entirely. But before I do that, I'm just checking that everything is even. I'm making sure that all of the stitches actually caught along the back and the front. And now we are going to snip these corners, so make sure you snip it away from the stitches. Don't actually snip the stitch, otherwise it will unravel in those corners. And this will make it so that when we turn the pouch inside out, those corners are going to be nice and sharp. I have this handy dandy little desk vacuum, and it helps me just catch all these little stray threads that can just cling onto my project, and it's just annoying, and I just love having it on my desk so that I can clean as I go. If you couldn't tell, I'm that type of person that's like, I need to clean as I go so that there isn't just like this massive mess left behind me. But before I turn this pouch inside out, I actually want to finish those edges with my serger. So I've raised the desk to standing level because I personally prefer to stand and serge, and I'm really excited to show you guys how this overlock stitching will look like. This just creates such a professional finish and edge, and as you can see, there's actually a knife that cuts off any excess fabric around the edge, and man, this Juki just goes so fast, and it's just so satisfying. I also turned off the light on the machine because I realized it was just way too exposed and you wouldn't be able to see what I'm actually doing. Before I bought this serger, I would actually just use a simple zigzag stitch on my regular sewing machine, and that would work in replacement of an overlock stitch, but it would be a lot slower on my sewing machine because there's only one spool of thread. However, since this serger uses 4 spools of thread, there are 4 different stitches that come together in an overlock stitch that makes this fabric pouch so much more durable. This is actually a portable at-home serger, so it's not an industrial serger, but it is a Juki, and this is my first Juki machine, and I will say I am so impressed by the quality and the speed and the power, and man, I hope that one day I can get like an actual Juki sewing machine, because I do love my brother's sewing machine, but after I have experienced the power of the Juki, I need more. But now you can see that beautiful finish on the edge, and it just looks so professional. So that is the excess fabric that got cut off, and that just makes things a lot neater around the edge. I'm just using my little mushroom vacuum to catch the rest of the thread. And now we can finally turn this project inside out. So you're going to shove literally all of that fabric through the little gap and just pull it out. I like to grab a chopstick or something blunt. Just don't use anything sharp because you might actually puncture a hole in the fabric, and I'll use that to get the corners out of the pouch. Now we are left with the opening in the lining where we turn the pouch inside out. I'll be using my sewing machine again, so look how conveniently I can just bring my desk down. And so I will fold the wrong size inward. You can use either a straight stitch or a zigzag stitch just to close up that opening, and do a little back stitch for good measure. And we are basically done sewing this fabric pouch. Now you can stuff the lining back into the pouch, kind of get the corners right. And if you look closely at the zippers, they're just so neat. There's no zipper bumps. It's just clean and crisp all the way around and perfect. You're only seeing me make one in this video, but I'll be repeating this 19 times for the shop update. So now you can see how much time and love and energy I pour into every single one of these pouches, and you can store whatever you want in them. Aside from that woven tag that I attach, I think this pom-pom pull tab is also another neat accent that I add to this pencil pouch, and it's just like a cute little thing to add to the zipper pull that will make it a whole lot easier. I use a lobster clasp and some embroidery floss and an embroidery needle. I already have a method down so that it doesn't fall apart, because glue would not hold it together, and there's a way that I sew the pom-poms together and then I end up felting the end of the thread back into the pom-pom so that it stays in place and won't come apart. While I make this pull tab, I'll answer some of the remaining questions. Someone asked a question regarding selecting materials. I will say, if you have the chance to, visit a fabric shop and familiarize with the different types of fabric there are. Sewing is incredibly tactile, so it's good to know what you're looking for. Patterns will usually specify for a particular type of fabric, so you shouldn't have to worry too much about it. There's also no need to buy everything at once, because the sewing tools I've accumulated over years and years, and I've learned what tools I use most often. Another person asked how to make patterns. You can easily make a pattern with drafting paper or cardboard. My mom would literally use the backside of cereal boxes to make patterns, and any type of writing utensil, a ruler, and some measuring tape. This ultimately depends on what you're aiming to create, but if you're looking to make clothing patterns, there's a video by With Wendy where she shares how to make patterns out of your own clothes. The next question, how do you prevent the thread from forming knots while sewing? I get so frustrated every time. I feel you. So if you are sewing by hand, just make sure that your thread is not absurdly long. I'll find that the longer the thread is, the more easily it can get knotted in the process. However, if you're using a sewing machine, I'll find that the thread gets knotted, mainly because something went wrong along the way when I was threading or putting the bobbin in, and I'll find that it's just easier for me to reinsert the bobbin or rethread the machine. But with hand sewing, you can actually run a little block of beeswax along the length of the thread, and that will kind of keep it pretty tame. And this is actually a trick used for bookbinding, but you can also use it for sewing, but you don't want it to become too waxy, otherwise it might show up on the project. I will also say the quality of the thread makes a huge difference. You definitely want to buy a decent, strong cotton or polyester thread. Cotton tends to break a little bit more, and polyester is a bit more heavy duty despite being literally plastic, but I found that when I've used cheap threads, they snap more easily, they tend to knot, or they kind of unravel the ply, I guess. And when I use a more decent thread, now you don't have to go out and buy the most expensive thread to ever exist, but I found that when I use a decent thread that is marketed as being strong and like pretty heavy duty, that thread just makes things a whole lot more efficient than me struggling with something pretty cheap and wondering if it's something wrong with my machine or if I'm doing something wrong when it could be the material itself. Another person asked a question about what beginner-friendly sewing machine is out there. I don't actually know what classifies as a beginner-friendly sewing machine other than price range or like affordability and the amount of stitches that are offered. I have a Brother SC9500 sewing machine, and I think it's both a computerized and quilting machine. So literally this year I found out so many capabilities that this machine had that I didn't even know, and it's been a fun little exploration. Also, this is the moment where I saw that I had a little threader thingy and I got upset with myself. The model I currently have is discontinued, and I've heard that if something is discontinued, that means it didn't sell well enough to be in production for a long time. But I will say I've had it for 10 years, it has not broken down, and it's served me quite well, so I'm sure there's an equivalent of what I have now in a more updated model. But with Wendy actually has a video where she compares a few of these beginner-friendly sewing machines against each other. Also, right now I'm needle felting that little bit of embroidery floss into the pom-pom, and that's going to hide it and also hold it together a little bit better. Here I am attaching the clasp onto the fabric pouch, and just look how cute it is. I remember when I sketched this idea for a pencil pouch, I literally had just like this simple sketch in my sketchbook of making this fabric pouch, and it's so wild to think that I've just physically materialize this in the real world. So some of y'all will be lucky enough to scoop up these handmade pouches during my next update. And here he is, the man, the muse, Kuni himself, chilling on my wool pressing mat.
Hello, welcome back. I really hope this video was insightful. If you are interested in these pouches, I have 20 of these made, 10 in each colorway, 10 in pink, 10 in blue, and these are made by yours truly. As you can tell, I still have some more of the pom-pom pull tabs to put on the rest. I will say my handmade goods sell out within the first 2 minutes of my shop update, but I'm really honored that people are lined up setting alarms to grab something that I poured so much love and labor into. I will also be having my last drop of fabric masks because I found a couple of mask elastics and I do have some remaining fabric, but again, I am not a machine, so it does take quite a lot of time to make every single piece. I will also leave all of the details for the shop update in the description or somewhere on the title once I have an official date. I would like to give a special shout out to my patrons because their support has helped me come so far in my small business and artistic career. I was able to buy a serger thanks to them, but more importantly, I can temporarily close my shop for periods of time so that I'm able to make new products and take the time to actually have these small batch of handmade items. All of my patrons get early access to my shop and also these YouTube videos. So if you'd like to join the patron community or you're just simply interested in these little perks, please feel free to support me over on my Patreon. Thank you so much for joining me on another creative adventure. Please give this video a like, that would help immensely. Leave a comment as to what you thought about this video. And if you're looking for more creative adventures, feel free to subscribe. I hope y'all get to enjoy the next shop update. If not, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you in the next video. Goodbye!